All right, so in this video, we're going to cover the beginnings and the backgrounds and the context of the Crimean War. So the Crimean War is going to go on from 1853 to 1856. So the Crimean War is helpfully situated right in the middle of the 19th century because it acts as a really nice turning point. It is the midpoint of the 19th century and really serves as a pivot point for what is to come. Now, this, not to go off on a tangent here, but this serves as a pivot point where 1848 might have served as a pivot point, but nothing came of it. And the revolutions of 1848 are often described as the turning point in history in which history did not turn. So things might have changed in 1848 had those revolutions been successful, but the turning point actually is the Crimean War. So in some alternate history where the revolutions of 1848 actually worked, that might have been the pivot point, but in our history, it's the Crimean War. So there are a number of reasons why we look at the Crimean War, and that's what we're going to look at here. So we're going to look at the context and the background to set up the war, which we'll cover in the next video. So the Crimean War was the first major industrialized war. So we see mass-produced weapons, soldiers moved along railroads, it was also a war that was transmitted to the people at home in almost real time. So this is the first war with real-time war reporting due to telegraphs. I had a lot of trouble writing that word, telegraphs. So daily, reporters would send word back to their home capitals about what was going on in the war. So for the first time, people are getting reports from the war pretty much in real time. They were finding out what happened to their forces pretty much daily. There were daily reportings in the newspapers. This also is responsible for the modern profession of nursing. So let's talk about nursing for a second. So the person that's usually responsible or given the credit for the profession of nursing is Florence Nightingale. So she was the daughter of a wealthy British family, and she was educated, and she had money and prospects, but she volunteered to go help the war effort. So she was given like basic medic training, and she went off to be a medic in the Crimean War. And she did this after reading all the deaths due to disease. So she thought it was her patriotic duty to go help however she could. And so after reading about the soldiers who died of disease, she went off to help. And that's probably partly connected to the real-time war reporting. Now, when she got there, she realized that the disease was exacerbated, it was made worse by the poor sanitation. So being, the daughter of a wealthy British family and educated and reading the news, she probably was familiar with the stuff that Edwin Chadwick was doing and noted that when you don't properly clean up after yourself, it causes disease. Now, no one listened to her because she was a woman. But the government ordered the hospitals cleaned, and lo and behold, the deaths by disease dropped. And she became a popular hero back home. And she wrote some of the first nursing textbooks. And this opened up a whole new career option for women. Now, remember, this is always something that women had done. Women were always seen as the caretakers and the people who would take care of you when you're sick or injured. That had always been the case, but being a doctor had become a male profession, because now it is connected to education and science, which were things that were now associated with men. So women couldn't be doctors, but they could absolutely be nurses who are kind of subservient to the doctors. Now, you might be making this connection as you're listening to this. There are a lot of connections here to the U.S. Civil War. They happen at roughly the same time. The Civil War was the second major industrialized war. The similarities even go down to nurses. So the Crimean War had Florence Nightingale. The U.S. Civil War had Clara Barton, who started the Red Cross. So there are a lot of connections here to the U.S. Civil War, and we're kind of seeing a parallel industrial track in the United States. So while this is going on in Europe, we're kind of seeing a similar thing happen in the United States. Okay, so let's look at some of the long-term background causes. So these are things that go back decades. And this will allow us to pick up some of the threads that we've dropped a little bit, and we can pick them back up here because they are relevant to the Crimean War. So one of these background threads that we can pick up is a brief check-in on the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire resisted industrialization. And unlike the Russians, who resisted industrialization because the nobility didn't want to, the Ottomans resisted industrialization for religious reasons. The new science and technology scared the religious leaders into banning them. And I mean, their fears aren't unfounded. I mean, if you look at the things that they banned, things like observatories or the printing press, their fears aren't unfounded. If you look at what happened in Europe as a result of observatories and the printing press, it led to the Reformation and wars of religion and the 30 Years' War. So there were a lot of reasons why banning those things might not be a bad idea. So these things were banned, and industrialization kind of fell behind because they resisted science and technology. Another thing going on in the Ottoman Empire was that the government was becoming increasingly corrupt. The Janissaries, who used to be the premier fighting force in Eurasia, had resisted changes to the government. So they were kind of keeping the government from progressing or evolving. They were another check on the Ottoman Empire moving forward. The Janissaries did not want the government to change. And the Janissaries actually launched a coup in 1826 called the Auspicious Incident. I'm not quite sure why they called it that, because the coup failed, and it led to the Janissaries being disbanded and a number of them executed. In 1831, as we mentioned before, the Greeks declared independence. And this was supported by the other great powers. I bring all this up to say that while the Ottomans are kind of on the decline, the Russians look at the Ottoman situation and they smell blood in the water. They want to take advantage. So they start pushing the Ottomans around. Hoping to get what they're always hoping to get. Hoping to get some warm water ports. Now, keep in mind, we're now in the middle of the 1800s, but these wars between the Ottoman Empire and the Russians are not modern. These look like battles from the 1600s. So these are not industrialized battles. These do not look like they are in the time period that they're in. And even though the Russians did their best to squash any changes to the status quo in Europe, the 19th century saw Russia push farther east into Alaska and south pretty much to the border with India. And eventually, the Russians and the British will meet in northern India. The British moving north through India, the Russians moving south to India. And we get this thing called the Great Game, which was kind of this big foreign policy spy battle between the Russians and the British over who would control South Asia. And spoilers, the British win. And they basically control all of India, although the Russians will hang around in places like Afghanistan and Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. They'll have a lot of influence in Central Asia, but the British are going to hold on to India. The last place I want to take a quick look at, because they're going to play a pretty big role in this situation, is France. Now, remember, the last time we were in France, we had the presidential election of December 1848. And in this election, Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, won in a landslide. He won big time. And Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was the leader of the Bonaparte family, and he saw himself as the guardian of his uncle's legacy. And so he wanted to recreate Napoleon's greatness for France. Now, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was no Napoleon. He thought he was, but he really just had delusions of grandeur. So he wanted to recreate what Napoleon had done for France. And just like Napoleon had done, when Louis Napoleon's presidential term was up, he did what his uncle did. He overthrew the government and named himself Napoleon III, Emperor of France. So this happens in December of 1852, right before the war starts. So he wants to make his name. He wants people to remember Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. So one of the things he does is he decides he's going to recreate Paris. He's going to recreate Paris and make it modern. So he sets his architect to work on this. And this guy's name is Baron George Haussmann. And he basically tears down Paris and rebuilds it over about a 20-year period. So Paris is torn down, which forces all the poor people to move to the outskirts. So they had all been kind of in the middle of Paris, and Haussmann blows everything up in the middle of Paris and rebuilds it so that it looks like the Paris we now know of. The other thing that he does is that he makes all these big, wide boulevards. And they just look nice, but there's an ulterior motive to this. With these big, wide boulevards, you can't put up barricades. So the Paris we now recognize as Paris was built in the 1850s and the 1860s by Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann. So it's torn down. All the poor people in the middle of Paris are forced out because they can't afford to live in these really nice places in the middle of Paris. And we get all these wide boulevards. So we can't put up the barricades that led to Louis Napoleon Bonaparte coming to power in the first place. Now, there's one more thing that Louis Napoleon wants to do to recreate his uncle's greatness. And that is beat Russia in a war. So when the opportunity arises for France to get into a war with Russia, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte is going to jump at the chance to avenge his uncle's defeat at the hands of the Russians in 1812. So we will look at the war itself in our next video. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.